Chapter 23. The influx of the rational mind into the animus, and by means of the animus into the body, and the influx of the animus into the rational mind. 470. That the animus flows into the rational mind is clearly seen from experience. For our rational mind is possessed wholly as it were by affections of the animus, since we desire what the animus desires, and rush as it were blindly or without any understanding into its concupiscences. The cause appears evidently a priori, since the internal intellectories are what taken together constitute the animus, to whose internal form and external form must correspond. The external form is the brain or the common sensory. As, accordingly, the affection of the animus is, such is the state of the sensory. For the state of the sensory puts on that form which agrees with the affections of the mind. So long as this form remains, no thing else, however grateful or harmonious, can be insinuated into the mind unless it agree with this state. The universal state includes and contains all special and individual states. The universal being formed, all the special states flow into it as harmonious. The intellectories are what form the change of state agreeably to the loves of the animus. Thus the animus flows into the state of the mind. The common animus is the agreement of all the intellectories according to that influx from the senses and from the blood. These form and move the common and external form to which the internal form corresponds. 471. When, therefore, the rational mind with the consent of the intellect remains in the state of the animus, which is that of all the intellectories, then it is blindly occupied by these flowing in. But when it dispels these and rejects the affections of the animus, or holds them in check, then it is enabled to put on more perfect states. These changes may be brought upon the more rational mind through sicknesses, and in that case by influx and by correspondence. By influx it may be, because diseases and diverse external accidents may so change the sensory that it can put on these states rather than those, but they are still states of the intellect. By correspondence, because the mind observes in misfortunes and sicknesses that the peculiar passions of the animus, such as vengeance, anger, envy, hatred, destroy the mind, and so it is imbued with piety and the virtues. Thus the mind itself by its own liberty changes the animus according to the occasion by reflection and correspondence, and puts on a state agreeing with more perfect loves, and so can the animus or its internal form be changed. 472. But to change the animus is to change the nature itself, as to change a good animus to a bad one, which is easily done, or a bad to a good one, which is more difficult. This can only be done by means of the rational mind and its understanding, let that understanding be either really its own, or one induced by faith or by authority. Nor is the nature changed even then, unless we shun and abhor evils, and never bring our mind into that evil state, and unless, as often as it falls into it, we snatch it forth with the liberty given us, and put on that state which agrees with a more perfect love. Nor does this avail, indeed, unless we remain a long time in this state, and exert force and violence upon the other, and by frequent works and exercises of virtue put on the opposite, and so continue until the mind shall have drawn to itself a new nature, and expelled as it were the old, so that as often as the old returns, we are aware that it must be resisted. Thus, and not otherwise, can we put off the bad nature and put on the good, a most difficult attainment in this life without the divine grace and aid, but in the same degree and end worthy of the greater mind if we apply ourselves. And what does not appear to be whole in us, we shall thrice best obtain by prayers to God. So nature, as it were, bends and changes nature, not indeed by influx into the intellectories or substances of the mind, but by correspondence and reflection. For the intellectory knows truths, or what is true and what is false, and as it expels the hatred of truth, then the love of truth succeeds in its place. Chapter 24. Influx of the spiritual mind or of the soul into the animus, and of the animus into the spiritual mind. 473. The pure intellectory is that in which the animus at first resides, for it is in this as a pure natural mind. This, because it is of the intellectory, which is formed entirely from the substance of its own soul, must of necessity be also formed after the mind or spirit of its own soul. So that such as is the soul, such shall be the animus in its very formation, even while lying concealed in the womb, and during earliest infancy. For then indeed the animus is entirely subject to the spiritual mind. But afterwards, when the rational mind is formed, and the states of the intellectory begin to depend on this state of the sensories, then begins as it were an inversion, and the animus depends on an influx of objects and of harmonies through the external senses from the world and by the blood from the body. 474. From these facts it follows that the spiritual mind flows into the animus, even to being its essence and life. For this cannot exist and subsist without the spiritual mind. Wherefore also the spiritual mind always loves the animus. But when the animus rebels and wishes to render itself superior, then it is rejected by the spiritual mind, and a perpetual battle arises, almost as if it were between God and the devil. Each desires to occupy the rational mind, but the victory belongs to but one. Nor can the animus be expelled suddenly, but there must be perseverance even to the end of life. 475. When therefore the bad animus has been changed into a good one, or a good into a bad one, thus as an acquired nature tries to expel the old nature, then is the former animus changed, and the animus being changed, the state of the soul is thereupon changed, not by influx, however, but by correspondence, the rational mind acting as medium, and the divine grace concurring. There must be a disposition that the spiritual mind may be able to flow in with its loves, at least a rejection of the loves of the animus, so that the soul may be disposed to flow in with its spiritual loves, or at least that the mind may be disposed to the influx of those loves. The intellect here contributes nothing, except it be from what is revealed. But faith springing from God, and his divine power being implored, his spirit flows into the soul and changes its state, or perfects it. But long exercise is needed, if the soul be bad, that it may become good, although not so long to restore a good soul by a change of mind. Thus there is a certain election of souls, for without a miraculous and particular favor, a bad soul cannot at once be made good. But there must be a self-compulsion, and most ardent prayer, and continual zeal for that which is truly spiritual and divine. These appear to be the true principles for our attainment of spiritual perfection. For something spiritual and divine flows down from above into what is below, nor can what is without bring any change upon what is within, except by correspondence, and such correspondence does not exist in the soul except from the divine gift. The influx of the spiritual loves of the soul into the rational mind, and the reverse. 476. The spiritual mind, or what is of the soul, can never flow into the rational mind except through the animus or by its means, hence only while the animus is subject to the spiritual mind. Therefore, in order that the spiritual mind may flow in, the animus must be subjugated, so that it obey and does not command. For the soul cannot flow into the internal sensory except by means of the intellectory. Hence we see how the spiritual can flow in, namely, when the affections of the animus are wholly submissive, and are held in check so as not to occupy the mind, and when the mind suffers itself to be acted upon, and not even now, unless the intellect knows from revelation what part is to be chosen or what is divine, the verily good, the just and true. Then, inasmuch as the mind does not understand this of itself, it ought to pray to God that he will inspire faith and love, for obtaining which many spiritual means are revealed. Thus at length the spiritual mind is able to flow into the rational mind, for so remote and deeply within dwells the spiritual mind that it is impossible to approach it immediately, or except by a universal means or by the animus. Hence it is evident how difficult it is to turn a bad soul into a good one, and that this is the work of divine grace alone. Only there must be the persevering human application. Chapter 25. Inclinations and Temperaments. 477. There are innumerable human natures or inclinations, since no man is similarly inclined with another. But all these inclinations, which are infinite in variety, may be reduced to three general ones, namely, the inclination of being wise, or to honor or virtues; the inclination of knowing, which is an active principle and is natural; and the inclination of understanding, which may be called intellectual. 478. The inclination of being wise, or the spiritual inclination to what is honorable or virtuous, is derived from the soul, and indicates a good soul or a spiritual mind, which is determined by true loves. But since the body is formed into an image of the operations of the soul, it follows that this inclination must be connate. The seeds of honor and the virtues seem to be connate, and prevail in whole families and their posterity. The virtues themselves are innumerable. One person inclines to this virtue in particular, or to this virtuous quality, and another to that. The reason why the inclination exists is to be sought in the spiritual state itself of the soul, which state is derived by birth from the parents, whose soul the progeny inherits. To the parent, however, it has come by frequent exercise of virtues, and the practice of piety lasting to the end of life. That posterity may obliterate the crimes of parents, and also on their parents' account may receive reward, is proved in all the histories of the world beyond the possibility of doubt. 479. The inclination of knowing or of learning the arts is also inborn, since we are born poets, musicians, architects, sculptors, and into many other avocations, as experience proves. But this aptitude is derived from parents and is perfected by use. Hence there must be industry in exploring the natures of particulars, even in boyhood itself. And when any one is perfected in those things to which he inclines, he may climb to the highest round, for his desire aspires thither. This inclination derives its origin from the intellectory and its animus. For the first intellectory is infused by the parent and insinuated into the ovum, from which similar ones are procreated. This intellectory is more inclined to certain mutations of state than to others. Hence also the sensories derive their proclivities to certain mutations of state, that is, to the forming and receiving of certain ideas, which at once delight the animus, since they correspond to its mind. 480. The inclination of understanding. Some are born with a prodigious memory, by which they can imitate an intellect. or into a facility of expressing the senses of their animus, into a presence of mind, to meditation or fantasy, some to judging profoundly even in regard to wisdom itself, although they are lacking in wisdom, some to certain sciences, as to mathematics, philosophy, history, and many other branches. This also is derived from the parent by the same cause, namely, that the senses are more inclined to putting on these mutations of state than others, but the inmost cause is found in the intellectory, in the mutability of its animus, and in the love and affection thence arising, for as it was in the parent, such is it in the offspring. 481. But all these inclinations may be changed by age, both from external and especially from internal causes, since our intellect is being formed and the rational mind coming into use. Hence many affections and loves can be insinuated and become habitual, which are handed down to children by propagation. Nevertheless, the inclination of wisdom or the spiritual mind is longest to remain, because it is more remote from the rational mind, nor does it accordingly suffer itself to be changed, for God always inspires and provides its destinies, so that it shall not perish, except it be in its posterity. Temperaments. 482. There are 4 temperaments enumerated, namely the sanguine, the choleric, the melancholy, and the phlegmatic. These are merely inclinations of the animus or the diverse animi into which we are born. The sanguine temperament indicates a state in which the animus is conspicuously present in receiving sensations and producing ideas, prone to various affections alike, thus not tenacious of opinion, easily suited, lively. This animus beams forth in the face, eyes, speech, voice, gestures, and particular actions, and a description of it is furnished by the physiologists. The choleric temperament indicates an animus not so prone to pleasure and various desires, but serious, sometimes indignant and morose, if another does not favor one's opinion or one's love, but otherwise with a good man, loving in general what is honorable. The face and outward form belonging to this temperament are also described by these writers. The melancholic temperament indicates a sad mind, immersed in fantasies, indulging more in internal than in external feelings, more averse to pleasures, rather an internal than an external man, unlike the sanguine temperament, tenacious of opinion, believing in hypotheses and opinions as truths, and thinking oneself wiser than any. It is vehement in the affections into which it falls, and increases them by its own imagination, is a lover of solitude, or of those companions to whom it is accustomed, and hates variety. The phlegmatic temperament indicates an animus prone neither to anger nor to other affections, silent, reticent, patient, but cherishing an inward ardour, slow in acting, and so on. 483. But these temperaments are not sufficient to express the changes of the animus, for they are assumed from the state itself of the blood, and from the indications of the face, since the animus shapes the face to itself as an image, as it likewise disposes the liquids and the blood, in order that they may serve or favour itself. Therefore he who derives this or that nature from habit or from constitution, natura, has his blood disposed to this nature. But inasmuch as the temperaments express only the external form of the animus, from which some wish to deduce the internal, I am not therefore certain whether the inclinations of the animus can properly be reduced to these genera or species, and whether they exhaust the specific variations. This is clear, that as diviners they are very deceitful, and that they change with change of age. For the blood to which the temperaments belong is changed in various ways, as we call this one sanguine who enjoys a more flowing or delicate blood, choleric whose blood is sharper, more bilious, more flecked, and drier, melancholic if the blood is more hard and dry, and phlegmatic if it is more sluggish and tenacious. 484. The animus, prone to receiving and giving forth affections, and consequently to external and internal sensations, is ready and quick, and is called sanguine. But the animus which is languid toward the internal and external sensations and affections is phlegmatic. The animus vehement for its passions and internal and external sensations is choleric. The animus slow toward the same is melancholic. 485. Thus we are able to draw distinctions in the animi rather than in the blood, and we may substitute them for temperaments. For it is the animi that are prone, vehement, and languid toward passions and affections, and hence also toward the internal and external sensations, inasmuch as the sensations follow the animus, as they cannot be separated from the animus. As is the animus, such is the blood, and such the form of the body and its forces.
Chapter 26. Concerning Death. 486. We have shown above what the body is and what is its form, or that the body consists of forms inferior, by orderly and successive degrees, to the soul which is the spiritual form. Thus the body consists of purer and grosser parts. The form of the soul is spiritual, that of the intellectory is celestial, that of the internal sensory is vortical, that of the external sensory or the brain is spiral, and that of the appendix itself, which is properly called the body, is circular. Its bones, cartilages, and similar parts are of the angular form. Likewise, the many elements which enter into the blood and constitute it, in every globule of which every form is concealed, from the first one to the last. 487. These forms are so connected that one holds the other most closely, so that they appear like one entity, even though they be most distinct. Thus the soul is said to descend from its heaven into the world, when it brings itself into such forms, and shapes its organs out of itself and its own substance, whose forms at length are corporeal and material. The cause of this is that the soul may be able to engage in the functions of this lowest world, and operate in a manner conformable to its forces. Since if it did not put on a corporeal form, it would never be able to walk upon the earth, to lift weights, to cultivate the soil, to procreate offspring, and to form a terrestrial society, but can only live in some sublunary region. Wherefore the body is formed with a regard to the performing of these functions, and thus otherwise in man than in the quadrupeds, reptiles, birds, and fishes. All are formed according to their nature, to which are adapted the gifts which each shall exercise. 488. The destruction of these ultimate forms is called dying, and the lowest are those first destroyed, and then in order the purer and the higher, even up to the soul or the spiritual form, which cannot be destroyed. First the angular form is destroyed, or their connection is severed, and the angular bodies which are in the blood and in the humours are dissipated. Wherefore so slight a portion of the blood is seen remaining in the dead. Afterward the circular form, or the form of the several viscera, is destroyed, and also the outward form of the body, which collapses, then the brain or the spiral form, and so the remaining ones in their order. 489. Anything is said to die, or to be destroyed, when that which is proper to its form perishes or is dissolved. Thus the situation, and the connection of the parts, their order, and thence their state, are the peculiar property of a thing, and besides these there is nothing which is proper to any form, and when these are dissolved, then the form perishes or dies, and then all that affection to which was adapted to it passes away. Thus the soul is no longer able to perceive those things which agree with itself, namely, the modifications and affections of the ultimate world and its harmonies, or sensations and the like impressions, nor to perform the other bodily functions, for every muscle is destroyed. and although each motor fiber may remain, still the property of the muscle as such perishes, for the situation, connection, order, and state of its motor fibers are destroyed. The motor fibers may be dissolved and die, and still the nervous fibers which compose them remain. On the dissolution and perishing of the nervous fibers, the simple fibers remain, and so on. So also in the other viscera, and even in the organs. For as these were successively formed, so are they successively dissolved, or as they are born into life, so do they perish, or are born out of life. De nascentur. The lowest forms, because they are changeable, inconstant, imperfect, and their determinations less harmonious, are always the first to die, and so in order up to the foremost. The triangular form perishes before the circular before the spiral, for there is always something of the perpetual added, or something of the finite and inconstant taken away as the form ascends. This is the reason why the dissolution of forms, and hence of the body, which consists of forms of this kind, takes place in this order. 490. Hence it follows that more time is required for the dissolution of any higher form than of a lower, and more for that of a circular than for that of an angular form. Thus death proceeds from the external to the internal man, and the more slowly as the progress is more to the interiors. 491. But let us take the blood as an example. A globule of this consists of all the forms even to the first spiritual. The red blood is first dissolved, and the angular elements are dissipated, which effect takes place immediately. Next the pure blood then remaining is dissolved, but after considerable lapse of time. Then remains that which is properly called the animal spirit, or its individual part. This is not readily dissolved, because it is a celestial form. After this remains the soul, purified from all that is earthly. 492. Thus by death, that is given back to the earth which was taken from the earth, as whatever was in the blood and its humours, and to the air what was likewise taken from it, as also to the ether. That remains which is purely animal, and the animal property, namely the soul, anima, which is alone what lives, and lives in the body according to its organic forms. Thence all that life dies which belongs to that organism, that is, the external, ultimate, lowest, and inferior life of the soul. Therefore dissolution is predicated of the organism, and death of the life of that organism. 493. The question arises, therefore, what lives die, or what organic connections are dissolved? For there are as many degrees of life as there are degrees of organs. The life of the tongue is different from that of hearing, that of the ear different from that of the eye, and that of the eye from that of the internal sensory, which is called perception. The life of the sensory is, further, different from that of the intellectory, and that of the intellectory from that of the soul, which is spiritual, and is all in the remaining lives, in which it lives according to form and by forms. The forms themselves are called organic, and they are the substances themselves whose affections are called sensations. 494. In order, therefore, that we may know what forms are dissolved or what lives die, this is sufficiently beyond question, that the common life of the body dies, or that the general nexus of all its parts is dissolved. Likewise, the external sensory organs, touch, taste, smell, hearing, sight, with organs of each, as also the internal sensory, with the intellect and the rational mind, that is, the cortical glands, with the changes of their states. For there was no such intellect in the embryo, hardly any in the infant. It has increased with age, is completed in the adult, then decreases in old age, is enfeebled and suffers in disease, and therefore also dies with the body. This intellect indeed has been acquired, to the end that the soul by means of it might perceive what goes on outside of itself, and indeed through the senses, and also that it might perform those functions which are to be exercised in this lowest world. When the soul no longer lives in this ultimate world, nor wishes longer to perceive what is going on here in these lowest spheres, nor what requires to be done in the earth, and in a terrestrial society, then with the necessity and the use the faculty itself perishes, and also the organ predestined to this use. Oh, how miserable should we be if after death we lived in a rational mind, with our imperfect intellect, with our inconstant will governed by so many changing states and desires, and we ourselves partly spiritual and partly animal. Such a mind could equally be changed, and after its intervals die, in the future as in the present life, for it would not have changed its nature. Therefore our rational mind, with its desires and affections, and our intellect, with its principles, opinions, and reasonings, die, and do not survive their body. 495. As for the pure intellectory, to which belongs the pure natural mind, this indeed also seems to die or to be dissolved, but after the longest delay, for it is a celestial form, and there are no forms present which can destroy it. But how long this continues, it is not in our power to say. As, for instance, how this mind or animus can survive a long time after death, and not be able to operate, as its common or external form is dissolved, and it is yet unable to acquire to itself a new form. But this let us dismiss as something wholly unknown, whether, for instance, the human animus may survive the life of the body even to the last judgment, when its parts are to be resolved into their principles by a most pure elementary fire. Into these mysteries, however, let us not penetrate. 496. But it is asked, why must the body be dissolved, or the corporeal life extinguished? The reason why this is ordained of the divine providence is very evident if we regard the end of creation, that, namely, there be a universal society of souls, which shall constitute heaven, and which would be impossible without a seminary upon the earth, and without the death of those dwelling therein, and thus a perpetual succession, as also in order that souls may be formed in their bodies and reformed into the eternal state. What is earthly and corporeal cannot be perpetual, because it is changeable in itself, inconstant, imperfect, and always decreasing. Death is therefore inseparable from the corporeal life, especially since it is subject to the will of the rational mind, which always takes away the corporeal life. Que semper aufert vitam corpoream. 497. Beside this, the soul never would be able, without death, to be left to its own right and free will according to its nature of living, for it is interwoven in the body, or is the form of its own body, and so bound into it that it cannot act otherwise than according to the ability of those forms which it has attained. Thus it is most limited, and nothing is left to it but to wish and desire other conditions. In order, therefore, that the soul may be left to itself, it is necessary that its ultimate form be dissolved. Even the soul itself desires often to be dissolved, especially when the loves of the animus have driven out the pure loves, and the soul lives, as it were, subjugated to the body. Then the soul itself conspires for the dissolution of the body, and indeed by those accidents which often befall us unawares, and are the causes of diseases and of death. But concerning these points more will be said elsewhere. These subjects, however, and that of death itself, must be treated distinctly and in their several divisions, that they may the better cohere.
27. Of the immortality of the soul. What the soul is has been defined and described above, namely, that it is immaterial, without extension or motion or parts. Hence it contains in itself nothing that will perish. But these are rather verbal predictions than true definitions, inasmuch as these names do not suit the higher forms, although they have something analogous thereto in their meaning. For except from analogy, one cannot avoid in the above definition the idea of nothing. Hence we betake ourselves rather to the form itself of the soul, since it is said that the form of the soul is spiritual, and that in the spiritual form those things are infinite which are finite in inferior forms. According to this description also every idea of place, thus of centre and surface, above and below, hence of motion and extent, perishes or is abolished. This follows from the idea itself of the form, namely, that it contains nothing in it which can perish. For there must be a changing in the position and connexion of parts in whatever perishes or is destroyed; and in a form which embraces no idea of place, centre, surface, or in which the centre and the circumference and surface are everywhere, destruction cannot be conceived of. This form is the very contrary of destruction, looking only to perpetuity, and indeed the more it is attacked, the more it resists every effort of destruction. If we examine forms in their order, it appears that as the form becomes higher or ascends to something superior, there is always something of perpetuity added. Thus in proceeding from the angular to the circle becomes perpetual, and all the lines and planes conspire to a certain perpetuity. But since this form, both by expansion from centre to circumference, and also by resisting the blow of other objects on its surface, either returns to itself, or enters upon some other state, therefore, lest it, the circular form, should perish by expansion, there is that which is perpetual in the spiral form. For the coils terminate in a kind of circular surface and return to it, and so by expansion, as also by this returning and keeping the unbroken surface in view, this figure is more sure of permanence. But still, inasmuch as this spiral figure has regard to a centre, it is yet liable to destruction. The possibility of perishing is done away with, however, in the forms still superior, as in the vortical and celestial. Thus such is the perpetuity in the spiritual form that, by virtue of its very nature, the form is secure. For one determination so regards another that each renders the other entirely safe from every injury. This results from the form itself, and the perfection in which it was created. Moreover, the spiritual form draws its essence immediately from God by inspiration, as a child from its parent, wherefore it acknowledges Deity or God himself as its Father immediately in creation, and that it is and exists from the immortal and eternal self, and can neither be destroyed nor become mortal. This is the reason why the soul is immortal, not from itself, but from God, who alone is immortal in himself. Thus through him does the soul become so. Since therefore the soul is the inmost and supreme of all forms, the first natural form itself is beneath it, and the inferior forms recede even to the angular, as earth recedes from heaven. Hence the soul can in no wise be touched, still less destroyed, by these lower forms which are in nature. Tell me, how can that which is inmost be destroyed by those things which are without, or that which is supreme by those which are below, or that which is simple by those which are compound, or what is prior by what is posterior, or what is most perfect in itself by things which are imperfect in themselves? For the imperfect derives its ability to exist at all from the perfect qualities which it contains. That which has in itself the infinite cannot be touched by the finite, still less destroyed. What is constant in itself cannot be destroyed by what is inconstant. The very superior forms themselves, especially the spiritual, are able to undergo infinite changes of their state, since in this their perfection consists. If we suppose any attack, collision, or the like to take place, such as occurs in inferior forms, then its state is able to be changed in any manner, and even to return to its natural state. Comparatively, as the natural substances which are most elastic can be bent and unbent, expanded and compressed, and still return to their own form. Thus as they are acted upon, so they act, and hence cannot be forced by any power or shock out of their natural state. Hence it now follows that nothing terrestrial can by any means touch the soul, whether it be what flows in air, ether, or fire, nor anything atmospheric, not even the most pure fire of nature. All these are far below the soul and have no contact with it, nor if they did could they exercise the least force, for the soul is safe in its own form. This also is evident in the body itself, where there is so great a disturbance of the most volatile parts taken up from the earth, the aerial atmosphere, and the ether, but still these do not disturb or injure even the least organic connection, place, or order. Myriads of the substances such as belong to the soul might meet in the smallest angular form. It would be like saying that a large beam might split into a single particle of some ether, when the fact is that myriads of such ether particles touch so obtuse a mass and even permeate its pores. Or as if you should say that the posts and beams of a house would extinguish the abstractive and directive force of the magnet, when this flows through the metals themselves and all things. Such would be the injuring or the obstructing of the operation of the soul or spirit by those things which are the most minute angular forms of nature or fire. For the magnetic force itself pervades even fire and flame, although in vortical forms. What then must not the soul be capable of, which possesses a form above the celestial? Besides, it is contrary to nature that that can be destroyed which is without weight or lightness, or which does not resist any weight, but acts according as it is acted upon, or where action and passion exactly correspond. But what agent can there be to destroy the soul? Since there can be none without or below it, for such things do not touch it. And in order to destroy the determinations themselves of the soul, the agent must at least reach them and touch them. But that also which is above does not destroy the soul, for this is divine. This preserves rather than destroys, and all the more surely, since human souls are the ends of creation, and constitute the kingdom of God. Nor indeed does that which is within destroy the soul, but it rather preserves it, as has been said above of form, showing how this protects itself. Spiritual death, however, is not the destruction of essence and of life, but of the better life itself, inasmuch as the soul is removed from the love of God, from wisdom, felicity, and perfection, and has ceased to be the image of God, and in heaven this constitutes spiritual death. For life itself consists of the truly spiritual loves, and when these are extinct, and in their place the contrary loves succeed, or hatreds, then that is said to be dead which truly lived. Truly to live is to love God and to be wise. In such life remains that form itself, and that essence itself which cannot perish. But there is only a perversion of state, or the state of the form is so changed that it no longer corresponds with the divine loves. And thus that image of God is lost which requires a state conformable to its loves. But it is asked why the life itself appears to die and be destroyed with our body, or what appears to be the life itself, rather of the body indeed than of the soul, as in the case of swoonings and ecstasies, dreams, drownings, the buried coming to life, embryonic existence, and other instances where the subjects are entirely ignorant after their resuscitation into the bodily life that they have been living meanwhile. No sign remains impressed on their memory of what they have thought, or indeed of their having thought at all. From these and similar examples it appears as if life were merely corporeal and not at all of the soul. But in these, as in innumerable other instances, we are deluded by appearances. For the life of the soul is not like that of our sensation or perception, or even like that of our thought, but is more perfect and superior, flowing into the thought itself and perfecting it in order that the mind may think. But the thought itself is something that is learned by practice. It is a faculty of the rational mind, and it perishes together with the body. What the pure life and intelligence of the soul is, and how it flows into the thought, may appear from reflection alone, in that, namely, the soul naturally enters into all the secrets of any knowledge when it operates in the body, and in the sensations and thoughts. This knowledge being not acquired by the soul, but inborn, and flowing in from the life of the soul. Does not the eye explore all the secrets of optics, the ear those of acoustics, in order to know of itself and of its own nature how to form sounds and how to put together what shall be harmonious? Does not even a little boy, whenever he thinks or forms a judgment or speaks, traverse all the first philosophy, logic, dialects, grammar, and so forth, yea, the most hidden things of these sciences? Thus it is that we learn from ourselves all this knowledge. When the soul acts, or produces the least action, or moves a muscle, it runs through all chemistry, mechanics, mathematics, and physics. Hence may appear what the life of the soul is in itself, namely, that it is such as it is of itself. It is not something acquired by learning, like the knowledge of the rational mind, whence come imagination and thought. Therefore the inmost life or essence of thought derives its origin from the soul, and thus thoughts may be withdrawn, and still the life of the soul, or the highest spiritual intelligence, remain. Since the life of the soul is such as we have described, it cannot leave any impress on our rational mind, for it is an intelligence so universal, pure, simple, and superior, that its thought cannot be exercised by means of words or material ideas in the manner that we think. Hence it can neither impress the sensory, nor in the absence of the ideas of memory induce any change in it. Inasmuch, therefore, as the soul in such wise shapes its ideas without speaking words, but rather understanding inwardly those things which the mind speaks or thinks, it follows that this life of the soul can least of all impress anything of its memory on the mind, which understands things only in the crudest manner comparatively. But that this very life of the soul is our own, yea, is the life of the body itself, and that we are to return into it after the dissolution of the body, is apparent from this, that the soul is that which experiences sensation, namely, it hears, it sees, it perceives, it thinks, judges, wills, but according to an organic form, and not otherwise. This also is vividly shown in that the soul does not seem to live separately from its bodily organs, except as these external forms are successively destroyed. Thus the sight appears as if it were in the eye, but the eye being closed we will still see with the sight, and the more the eye is closed, the more the internal sight and imagination are perfected. And so much is this the case, that the external sight may be rather a hindrance than otherwise to the internal sight. Likewise the imagination and thought seem so to cohere that without the imagination the thought would seem to perish. But yet, in order to think profoundly, and to enter inmostly into things themselves, it is necessary to remove the material ideas of the imagination, or to abstract the mind from material things, since only thus can we think purely. This comes by abstraction. Thus the thought returns and is separated as it were from its external form. Such thought also leaves almost no impress whatever on the internal sensory, except so far as it has become fixed in some material idea or figure. When, now, this entire material idea recedes, there remains the life of the soul, which can make no impression on the sensory, nor does it put itself forth as it is in the embryo or infant, although it is possessed of just as much intelligence in the smallest infant as in an adult mind of the acutest judgment. But it is unable to put itself forth except so far as the rational mind is furnished with ideas of the memory, by means of which it may express itself. Such is the life of the soul unmixed with ignorance, having no imperfection, having all knowledge in itself, so that it may be knowledge itself, truth, order, and intelligence. As such it can by no means perish. Nature which is destructible is subject to it, and so the life of that form seems to die. The veriest life of the soul is the veriest life appertaining to us, and it does not come to itself so that we may be conscious of it before all that life of the forms which are below itself, and in which it has been involved, has receded. These the soul itself destroys in order that it may free itself from their chains, and be restored to its own right and freedom of acting. For just as the soul knows how to form its own body, one viscus after another, how to escape from the womb, how to nourish itself at the breast, and many other things, Even as the caterpillar knows how to transform itself into the butterfly and to destroy its pristine form, so also does the soul know how to destroy its own forms, to restore itself to liberty, and thus to migrate from this dying, imperfect, and inconstant life to that which is immortal. And this could not take place without the death of the body's life. From these very operations of the soul it may be seen what its form is. For the soul is that very substance in which form has its being. Its intelligence is that distinguishing faculty and quality of the forces and modifications which we call form. Thus from form, and also from intelligence itself, it may be deduced and clearly seen that the soul is immortal.
Chapter 28. Of the state of the soul after the death of the body. 511. Everyone desires to know what will be the state of the soul after death. There is no one who does not conjecture that the future state will be such as was that of the bodily life, or that which was lived in the rational mind. For who that has not in his mind penetrated into the degrees of life can conceive that there is any superior, more perfect, universal, or abstract life than that in the rational mind? They are few who deny any continuance of that life which they attribute to the soul and to the animus. The wise men of the Gentile nations unanimously believed in this surviving of the soul, as may be seen from the Greek authors, the sophists, Plato, Aristotle, as also from Cicero, and all the rest. Besides, in order to place this doctrine beyond all chance of doubt, Pythagoras and Socrates even have attempted to describe the state of the soul after death. We Christians, still better informed out of the sacred scriptures, not only believe in the immortal life of the soul, but also that there is a happy state or heaven, and an unhappy state or hell. But let us pursue the psychological principles propounded by us in their order, and set forth what these principles dictate. 512. It is the common opinion that at once after the death of the body the soul is separated and flies away and leaves its corpse. But when we consider that the universal form of the body exists only from the one substance, the soul, or from the soul, for there is nothing which does not begin with the simple fiber, and the simple fiber is from the simple cortex, and so on. And since the soul is the real essence and substance from which is the universal organic form of the body, and thus the all in every part, and residing as it were inmostly and in the center of all, even in the blood itself, whose principal essence is the soul which is in it, it follows that the whole soul does not fly from the body in the moment in which the life of the body is extinct, but that it remains so long as there are any parts not dissolved in which it adheres. This is proved by many instances of those who some days after their funeral rites have been performed have come to life again, and continued a life of years among mortals, as the historians tell us. There are those also who have been suffocated in drowning or in constriction of the throat, and after days have revived. Meanwhile, the soul cannot have left the body, and when the obstructions are removed, the water discharged, the soul re-enters at once its abode. There are also those who resemble the dying in undergoing swoons, syncope, and like attacks, where nevertheless the soul does not depart, but remains and lives although the body be as it were extinct. There are also many examples even in the sacred histories of its being forbidden to violate the bodies and bones of the dead, so that they may remain in peace and not be dispersed. Samuel also was resuscitated, and many other instances are related in both sacred and profane history. We know as it were from an innate sense, or as if the soul itself dictated it, that if the bones of the dead are disturbed, their shades will confront the violators. And about such occurrences also many stories are told. The religion too of some people has been to kiss, venerate, and beseech the bones of heroes and saints, in order that these may give or procure aid. These things would be the merest vanities if the soul should go forth entirely from the body, and only that which is terrestrial remain. Meanwhile, from the tenor of our arguments, it follows that the soul which procreates the form itself of the body and of its parts, as also the blood and the animal spirit, can by no means be released from its bonds until the lower and more changeable forms be first dissolved. Although it is not to be denied that much of the soul may be dissolved from its bonds, still it is not on this account separated. It is contrary to the nature of spirits that those substances which are born and made for the completion of one system should be separated. What is interwoven with other parts may indeed be separated. Still, although dissolved from those bonds, it appears that entire separation from all bonds is impossible before the intervention of a most pure elementary fire, or until the conflagration of the world. 513. But it is asked, what kind of a life is that which the soul lives while it still remains in the dead body, the order, arrangement, and connection of whose organic parts is wholly destroyed? That life must necessarily be a most obscure one, or merely life without intelligence. This appears from the mere definition of intelligence. All intelligence supposes not only an internal form and change of state in the single sensories and intellectories, but also an external form of these particulars, or one enabling them to preserve a mutual arrangement and order. This order being destroyed among the particulars, and with it their arrangement and connection, the communication of forces, modifications, and affections at once ceases. But there succeeds a certain irregularity from which results a certain kind of life, not distinct and determined, but confused and obscure, which may be named barely life without intelligence. To understand, intelligere, is to live distinctly and according to a form not of particulars only, but one entirely consentaneous, which form is the reason. For our intellect is at once disturbed when the situation and connection of the sensory or cortical glands are disturbed, as we learn from the accounts of diseases of the head. The sight is destroyed or weakened by the disturbance of the fibrous or liquid parts. The case is like that of colors, when all the colors are mingled together with water, or when an infinite number of prisms and of the smallest irregular bits of glass are mixed together. There is then no distinct or beautiful color, but only a whiteness resulting, which is the conflux of all. 514. But when the organism is not yet destroyed or its order disturbed, there then remains a distinct life of the soul, as in the embryo, although the soul cannot establish a communication between its universal mind and intelligence and its rational mind, for reasons above given. Hence no memory of itself remains after its resuscitation. 515. But indeed, the substance of the soul, freed from its corporeal bonds, seems to live a distinct life, and indeed all the more distinct for being liberated from these its hindrances. For these most individual entities form a society among themselves, and institute a most distinct order, being left to their own liberty and awaiting companions. For the greater the society, the more perfect is the life. Whoever has lived longest, in him has the society, forming a unanimous body, become so much the largest. 516. Inasmuch as the soul is distinguished most completely into substances of spiritual form, it may be believed that the individual substances or forms will, after dissolution, become dissipated, and never again unite into the society of any one body. Such an opinion, however, arises from ignorance regarding the world and its purer nature, and that of purer beings. For we believe that there is a something which remains when the little bodily particle is resolved into smoke, vapor, dust, and ashes. But an entirely different process ensues from this. In that supreme, most pure and perfect world, or that where nature is simple and prime, we cannot conceive of a disjunction of those beings, which by virtue of their mutual harmony and likeness belong to a single body. Each living and spiritual substance of the soul recognizes its companion in the body as its own, nor can it live in mutual consort with any other. nor does anything prevent their coming together, for there is no space, place, or time to disjoin them. These conditions all belonging to an inferior nature, and not to the supreme. Place exists respectively to lower beings in whose relations there is an upper and a lower, or right and left, a center, surface, a diameter, thus in order that there may be a where. But in the supreme world, all respect of place is from soul to soul, since these are entirely distinct from each other. Nor can these substances of the soul be separated, for one recognizes, feels, knows the other, even if it were as far off respectively as the sun from the earth, or star from star. When indeed such gross organs of vision as the eye can reach even from the earth to the sun and stars, what may not the sight of the soul, the intelligence, include, capable as it is of being named a spiritual sympathy? Since nothing prevents the coming together again of these substances of the soul, it is therefore only our ignorance of the purer world which deceives us, and suggests a dissipation which in that world is an impossibility, especially since the omnipresence of the Divine Spirit acting upon all souls cannot suffer that anything pertaining to any one should be separated. For there is a spirit which unites all things beneath itself, joining the concordant, disjoining the discordant, and so collecting together all souls. This follows of necessity, since if we consider the influx of this universal spirit, it cannot do otherwise than join together all things that have respect to one body, and vice versa. 517. When similar phenomena occur in the world and in the lower and less perfect nature, why not in the superior and most perfect? For there nothing exists which is irregular, but only that which is most harmonious, concordant, and united. It is well known that shrubs, plants, flowers, roses, burned to dust, are brought to life again in water, their vegetative lives or spiritual essences being, as it were, excited anew by some means. The very figure itself being thus excited, if by the breaking of the vessel it falls back into its ashes, it yet again revives. And thus, sometimes these parts cannot be so disjoined and separated, but that they will come back into their pristine form, and unite again in their ancient friendship and habit after these vicissitudes, and indeed in such wise that they unite again into exactly their first form. Why then should not human souls do likewise after the destruction of the body? 518. I need not speak of those manifest sympathies also recognized in this lower world, which are so numerous as to forbid their being rehearsed. So great is this sympathy, and this kind of magnetism, that it may often be communicated among thousands of persons. These phenomena are, however, by some reckoned as mere idle tales. Still, experience itself establishes their truth, nor would I care to relate that the shades of certain ones after the death and obsequies of the body have become visible, which thing could never have happened, even admitting the fact which I do not, unless the animal spirit were mutually conjoined, and not separated from their common fellowship. At least such a bond and love intervene between the constituent parts of the body itself, that these preserve a mutual relation, and cannot be separated. And this too is the reason of the mutual love of those who love as to the body. 519. That every substance of the soul associates to itself another such substance is evident from the love of parents toward their offspring, whose soul the parent, because he knows it to be taken from his own, so inwardly knows and loves that he wishes again to be joined to it and to enter into it, which he endeavours in vain to do by kisses and embraces. What then will not the several parts of the universal soul of one body desire? Chapter 28, Part 2. 520. Meanwhile, this must be confessed, that the soul of one would never be distinct from that of another if the state of the one were absolutely similar to that of the other. But since it is provided that there shall always be some difference between souls, therefore they cannot be conjoined, but each soul must form its own body and must live its own life. Thus one soul knows the fellow substance which belongs to itself and its own system, and so, drawn by a certain sympathetic love, it is unable to unite itself with any other substance, for that is not its own, and cannot be united with itself into one body. A universal divine providence therefore reigns in distinguishing particulars from particulars, so that no one soul shall be precisely like another. 521. But it is asked, what is to be the form of the soul in heaven, whether similar to the bodily form or another which is called angelic? And then, whether the angelic form is like the human form? This, indeed, I do not think, that we are to put on the human form. For such a form exists solely for use in the lowest world. In heaven, souls are like birds, nor do they have intercourse with any earth. They have no need of feet or arms, hence neither of muscles, that is, of flesh and bones, for they are spirits. Nay, they neither require the red blood, nor ventricle, nor intestine, nor mesentery. For these things belong to the reception of food, to chilifaction, to nutrition, the making of blood, and similar uses. Nor is there need of heart, inasmuch as there is neither red blood, nor liver, nor pancreas, nor spleen. Neither are there teeth, jaws, throat, trachea, lungs, nor tongue. There is no use of air, of respiration, speech, digestion. Neither ear nor eye, for where there is no air there is no sound, and where no earth exists there is no vision, nor could this be of any use. Even the members of the brain, with the meninges, and the medulla oblongata and spinalis, will there be of no use. With the use itself perishes all necessity for their being. For what use could the generative organs exist? All these things will serve for no use as soon as we become spirits and angelic forms. Hence it would appear that the soul is not to receive that form which is imperfect and not celestial, unless, as some hold the opinion, there shall be created a new earth and a new atmospheric heaven, into which we shall be admitted like new inhabitants. 522. But it is asked, what form shall we have? This we can no more know than the silkworm, which when a miserable worm crawls over its leaves, but after its long endured labors is turned into an aurelia, and flies away a butterfly. It does not know that it is to have an entirely different body which shall agree with the atmosphere in which it is to live. It does not know that it will take on wings and be provided with members adequate to that new life. And so with ourselves, we are grossly ignorant about the nature of that purest aura which is called celestial, and in which souls are to live, being completely furnished with such a form that, like birds in our atmosphere, they may everywhere traverse their spaces and fly through universes and heavens, their members and their form being exactly adapted to that life. Therefore, until we know what that aura is, and what life we are to live in it, we are wholly unable to say what form we shall put on. This only may be said, that our future form is not to be such as this present one, but rather the most perfect of all, a form into which we shall be changed as nymphae and aureolae are changed to more perfect forms. A form to which our souls also aspire, and for this reason often would accelerate the death of the body. For this aspiration is inborn in the soul, and is not communicated to the body. 523. In the meanwhile, when the soul is left to itself, and is no longer connected with the organic forms necessary for the pursuit of the corporeal life there, it seems to be able to put on any form it may wish, so that if it should descend from heaven to earth, in a moment it might take the human form, for universal nature is so formed that it shall serve the spiritual life as an instrumental cause, so that it at once flows into conformity whenever the soul commands. Just as in the body, for the soul or spirit commands according as this or that act may agree with its will, and at once the body submits and hastens to obey. The soul wishes to view the visible world. At once the eye is shaped for every form of modification. It wishes to hear, and at once the wonderful organism of the ear exists. It wishes to walk, to fly, to swim. At once are provided the feet, the wings, the fins. And so with infinite other desires and capacities. Nay, the soul of the infant is often affected by the strong desire or by the fear of the soul of the mother in such a way that according to this single impression, a mouse, a frog, a rose, or other object appears upon the part of the body touched. These are evidences that nature readily hastens to obey when the soul commands. Accordingly, after death, when dissolved from these organic bonds, whatever form it wishes as agreeing with its state, it would seem capable of assuming. If, therefore, it should descend to earth, at once it would put on the human form. Nay, if occasion should require any other animal form, to will this would be all that is necessary. Everything else follows of itself. Nor would these be miraculous occurrences, for it would be no more contrary to nature than that one form out of an egg should put on a human form, or should in the skin show the mark of the dormouse, or similar impressions made during the tender period of growth. The soul is constituted in freedom of determination, nor is it any longer limited as on earth. It can likewise put off that form and dissipate it in an instant. Yea, it can present a burning countenance, and the like, as in the recorded appearances of the cherubim and the seraphim, and the angels appearing to the shepherds. The reason is that the whole form is from the soul, the very elements being at once assumed out of the surrounding atmospheres, and disposed in its intellectories and organs. 524. For even these essential determinations of the form depend on their action and interior principle within in the soul. The soul is not carried away with the affections of any animus into these or those impulses, but solely into the uses which are necessary. To love novelties, varieties, curiosities, is natural to the animus and also to the rational mind. For to these there is nothing which is not unknown. Not so with the soul, from which nothing is hidden. Wherefore it is never carried away by curious desire. It follows as a consequence that the soul forms for itself its intellectories, which it disposes in harmonious order, since without arrangement and subordination and coordination nothing intellectual can be carried on, and therefore it also follows that the form of the body is a purely celestial one, such as is the intellectory. But as to whether it be a vortical form, this indeed we may surmise, although these are among the secret things, and at best but mere conjectures. If any one sees them, reason alone has convinced him of them. When we live as souls, perhaps we ourselves shall laugh at what we have guessed at in so childish a manner. 525. It is not to be believed that in our soul existence we shall be wise in the same manner as while we were living in our rational mind or human intellect, in which there is always, however, more of ignorance than of understanding. This mind, or our thought, as it appears to us, becomes entirely extinct, and the life of the soul remains, which is ignorant of nothing, but of itself knows everything. Wherefore it is science itself and pure intelligence, which however does not speak or express its meaning by voice or words, these being so many material ideas, but it embraces at once everything which pertains to the subject of thought. For the intelligence of the soul is the same in the infant as in the adult and aged. It is what flows into our thought and makes us able to understand and philosophically to connect together all things which we think. Wherefore after death there is no such impure intellect. But when the soul flies away from the body, it is like going from a dense shade into the open sunlight, or coming out of a dark dungeon into the city of Rome, or into the whole world, or like a blind man being restored to sight. For the truths of our mind are mere hypotheses, fallacious principles, appearances, opinions, and the like. But those of the soul are the veriest truths themselves. 526. But the soul, being pure intelligence and a spiritual essence, is above all sciences and doctrines. For these are natural, and stand still or go groping around far beneath. The soul knows the secret things of these sciences, which can never be penetrated by the mind, although always approached. For the mind is no more able to utter these hidden things than algebra its series of infinites, expressed by the differential calculus in a long series, and incapable of reduction by the integral calculus. Therefore, as to its state of intelligence, one soul is precisely like another. 527. But as regards its state of wisdom, one soul is never absolutely similar to the soul of another. For one has within it more perfect and purer loves. It loves God above itself, and its neighbor as itself. Thus the soul of one is ruled by divine love. But that of another loves contrary things and hates what the former loves, and thus is rather to be called diabolical. From the study of spiritual loves, it is manifest how far souls may differ. Therefore, there are divine souls, or those belonging to the divine society, and there are those which are diabolical, belonging to the infernal society. All nevertheless enjoy the most perfect intelligence of the good and the true, but are affected with either the love or the hatred of these. 528. This nature souls derive in the corporeal life, and indeed by means of the rational mind. For the soul is then in the process of being formed into a good or evil state, but not into the intelligence of the true and the good. How the soul is affected has already been shown, and also what divine means ought to concur for improving and perfecting the state of the soul, for rendering it more complete and restoring to it its first divine image. But still, when the body has left and the rational mind has become extinct, then the human soul has been formed. And so much, and of such quality as it is, it remains forever, for nothing can be present to improve it more. There is no influx from a changeable mind, or one that may be perfected or depraved. The rational mind alone is capable of this. There is no struggle between it, the soul, and the animus, or between the loves of each, thence no hope of victory. The intelligence is pure and most perfect. There is therefore no changeableness in it, by which another state of the soul might be brought on. It is not annexed to any organic form which it obeys. In a word, such as it is, it remains forever, particularly as regards its loves and spiritual aversions. Consequently, as to eternal felicity or unhappiness. 529. Nor can this prevent the soul's knowing everything which its mind ever experienced in the body, or which the soul by means of the mind may have acquired in the world while an inhabitant of it. Since the intelligence is pure, it follows of necessity that it shall know again and be conscious of the particular things which are in every verity and in every goodness. For otherwise it would not be a pure intelligence, but rather a confused ignorance. From the changes of its own state or from its acquired state itself, it knows all causes, infinite as they are. For there is not the least act voluntarily done, but that the will, the desire, and the end of it has affected the soul, and in some way contributed to its state, and hence from its own state the soul knows every cause. It knows most perfectly that which in its own rational mind has been operating as a cause, and it also sees beforehand most perfectly what to expect, whether the happy or the unhappy. 530. Therefore, it enjoys the memory of the past, not such as is the memory and reminiscence of our sensory, which is given up to material ideas and images, but such as is pure and most perfect, so that not the least moment of the past life is hidden from it. Not even a word which has contributed to the changing of its state. For all this the soul understands not from any memory but from its own actual state, since all things past are present to it. Yea, even in natural things, where is the connection of causes and of contingencies, there is the presence of all future things. This flows from the intellect alone, which is the pure intelligence. 531. The soul itself cannot change its own state any better than the body its deformed countenance, distorted mouth, its humped back, or the muscle causing the distortion or bringing on the change of state. All this inheres as a natural deformity in the body, and the more it wishes to mend itself, the more it becomes deformed, so is it affected by its self-consciousness. 532. In the meantime, the soul possessed of such a state of intelligence cannot otherwise than know everything which takes place in the heavens and earths. In the heavens, by the communication of operations which cannot be otherwise than most perfect, when there exists in this life such a communication of minds, and a kind of sympathy between friends and relatives. Granting such a communication of souls, this can also be described. For the soul is occupied with its perpetual intuition of things past and present at the same time, and the celestial aura and common spirit of all things intervenes, which makes it impossible for the operations of one soul not to be communicated to another, since otherwise without communion there would be no connection of souls by love. This may be compared with our bodily hearing and vision, for there are auras and atmospheres which communicate to any distance things which occur most remotely, yea, the sight even takes in objects proceeding from the sun. Why should not the soul, which is pure intelligence, perceive the particular things which go on in other souls, wherever they are? Such a communion as this is a logical consequence resulting from the celestial aura, when its existence is admitted, and from the divine spirit embracing all things, and from mutual love as its effect. But this communication is not susceptible of comparison with that effected by the bodily senses, the sight and hearing, since nothing occurring in the universe can be hidden from the soul, for the intellectual sight can terminate only with the limit of the universe, as is evident from ocular vision.
Chapter 29. Concerning Heaven, or the Society of Happy Souls. 533. Such is the difference of souls and of minds, such the perpetual dissension, strifes, controversies, as well in things of philosophy as of theology, and in worldly and corporeal affairs, that one animus never agrees with another. Therefore so many schisms, heresies, and controversies are tolerated as though by special providence of God, and also so great power is allowed the devil at the same time, in order that he may destroy the lower and the intellectual minds of men, and thus impress upon each soul its own special state. This also seems to have been the cause why it was permitted to Adam to commit sin. For in the first age the soul of no one was distinguished from that of another, and thus there was no society. From this cause also seems to have resulted the strict prohibition of parents from entering into marriage with sons and daughters, and of brothers with sisters, and many other circumstances which would tend to conjoin souls, also that marriages are declared to be contracted and confirmed in God. Nevertheless, proofs are extant of the divine providence in the contracting of marriages, even to the least particulars. God also leaves everyone his own free choice in acting, and as it were decrees that the liberty of anyone shall not suffer the least injury, but rather that everyone shall be permitted to rush into his own destruction or that of others, since the liberty itself of human souls is the sole means of destroying the lower minds, and hence also the souls of those who are mutually affected. 534. The divine providence operates, therefore, especially in distinguishing particulars from particulars, inasmuch as it is the end itself of creation, that there shall be a most perfect society of human souls. For the ultimate end ought to be that which is the first and the last of creation, all things else being means to this end, as will appear if we examine each separately. The progression itself of means extends even beyond nature. Can anyone say that an earthly society can be the ultimate end when the body exists on account of the soul? Must there then not be some further end on account of which the soul and heaven and the universal exist? Can there be any other end than that there may be a society and kingdom of God to be constituted of all human souls? These conclusions are so clear that we do not know whether they can be called in doubt, and so manifest that they are capable of confirmation from everything existing in the world. 535. Since therefore no soul is absolutely similar to another, but rather some difference or diversity of state intervenes between all, this has come about not merely that souls may be mutually distinguished, but that the most perfect form of society may thence arise. In a perfect form of society there ought to be not only a variety among all, but such variety that the particulars shall so accord as to constitute at the same time a society in which there shall be no want which some one may not supply. Such a form there is in the atmospheric world itself or in the macrocosm, and such there is in every body between its constituent parts, be it the fibers, the cortical glands, or the other parts. This variety I call harmonical. It is such, in fine, that all the various parts are mutually related by a certain natural analogy, and thus constitute a society which may be one. For nothing can coalesce, and as it were, constitute one form unless there be an analogy between the determining parts and the determinations. Hence arises conjunction, and hence it is that harmony is pleasing and conjoins, but disharmony is unpleasant and disjoins. Therefore, a form of government can by no means be called perfect unless there be in it a variety, and in that a harmony wherein every one has a relation to another rightly, according to natural laws. The analogical or harmonical similitude itself resembles identity and union. In no other way is it possible for a most perfect society or form of society to be instituted. 536. But that harmonious variety does not consist in the external variety, but in the spiritual variety of souls and of love toward God and the neighbor, since the state of the soul imports solely its spiritual state, namely, that it may be near to its God. So long as any difference or any distinction is wanting, just so long may it be said that a certain place is wanting in heaven, so that all differences are to be supplied before the most perfect form can exist. 537. But are there to be many societies, and as it were many heavens, out of which is to arise a universal society which is called the kingdom of God? This seems also a possible induction, for all variety, even that which is spiritual, supposes some order, subordination, and coordination, so that in the earth one particular society has reference to another, and all taken together constitute a kingdom. This seems to follow as a conclusion from the supposed admitted variety of the state of souls. For that the form of governments may be perfect, it is necessary that all the societies shall produce a general harmony among themselves, just as the several members constitute each a particular harmony. 538. This is called the kingdom of God, but the true kingdom of God is on this earth, which is the seminary of that kingdom above. This is not confined to any certain religion or church, but is spread over the whole globe, since God chooses its members out of all, namely out of those who had really loved God more than themselves and their neighbor as themselves. For this is the law of laws. In this culminate all rights, as well natural as divine. All other things, including ecclesiastical and other forms, are means which lead to this. This, his church, God collects from the universal globe until all places shall be occupied, allowing that difference in the form of government still to remain which is necessary in order that the most perfect unity may result. 539. but there could be no such society without its head or chief, who should be indeed a man without offence or wrong, the conqueror of all the affections of the lower mind, the embodiment of virtue itself and piety itself, loving God above self and his associates as neighbours, thus a divinity in himself, in whom the universal society would be represented, and through whom the members of the society might have access to their deity. Without such a king of souls, in vain would a society be collected, exist, and subsist. This also follows of necessity from the admitted form of the government, from the disparity of the states of all, and from the nearness of God through love. This form would therefore be constituted wholly by those purer ones of every degree, consequently by the purest of all, who should be without sin, that is, by our Saviour and Preserver Jesus Christ, in whom, through faith and love, we are alone enabled to approach the divine throne. Note: so far as this refers to man's ability to approach and to know God as a visible and personal being, by means of the divine humanity which he assumed and glorified in Jesus Christ. This expression is not inconsistent with the theological teachings of the true Christian religion, but it would be wholly so if understood as implying the mediation of Christ as a person distinct from the Father, and thus a trinity of persons instead of the trinity of person, or the unity of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost in the one and only divine person, our Lord Jesus Christ. Just as the soul, body, and operation unite in constituting the person of one man, so the Apostle Paul teaches that in him, Christ, dwelleth all the fullness of the Godhead bodily, and our Saviour himself declares that he is in the Father and the Father in him, that he that seeth him seeth the Father, and that he and the Father are one. Also he breathed on his apostles and said, Receive ye the Holy Ghost, implying that this is a divine power or energy imparted from himself, and not a distinct or third person in the Trinity. See the doctrine of the Lord and the true Christian religion throughout. 540. Behold the form of the government of society, or of celestial societies, yea, the kingdom of God briefly shadowed forth. The form of the government itself cannot wholly differ from the perfect form of government of earthly societies. Whatever feature in these is imperfect is there most perfect. And those are spiritual loves which distribute the dignities, and they are nearer to their chief. Thus also each one possesses his own heaven, and enjoys his own happiness. 541. In such a society there cannot but reign every joy, happiness, and felicity, replete with the inmost essence and most delicious sense of love and of virtues. But no tongue can describe that felicity and those joys, for they exceed by infinite degrees corporeal delights, which in comparison stand as shadows or mere trifles of delight, and hardly to be counted as such. If human delights, which are innocent, should be exalted to their highest degree, or concentrated in the inmost, then some idea might seem to be formed of it. It is a universal society, whose units are to be counted by myriads. It is the most perfect communion of all, or a perfect consociation of spiritual minds, such that whatever is in one mind is common to another. Thus there is one soul in the society, and likewise every variety possible in the universe, which diffuses and at the same time concentrates the felicities of mind. The happiness is concentrated upon each one of the society, and by each one it is diffused, and thus it is multiplied infinitely. If there are many societies, constituting among themselves also a form of government and of variety. For whatever was once pleasant in life, and at the same time pure, is now exalted to the highest degree. Nor is the communication of minds effected by means of language, but by a certain activity of mind, whence comes the angelic speech, which expresses nothing whatever by words or by material ideas, but is able at once and by one operation to express what we can only do by thousands of words. The sight is not ocular, but internal, so that we may know what goes on in the universal society with its infinite variety. For there is an intuition of all past things as if present, that is, as if divining by the aid of all things that ever have been on the earth. There is a representation of the universal heaven, in a word, the infinite varieties which suffuse souls with ineffable delights. Nor does impure love exist there, but the pure friendship which has succeeded in its place. Nor is there any thought of the future, or desire, hope, or anxiety. All things are there without anxiety, and without fear of loss, most constant, eternal. Hence the veneration and adoration of their deity, in whose praise the heavens of heavens resound, the other spiritual delights being elevated thereby to a still higher degree. But these are only a few of the features of that life, for to narrate them all were impossible. Such seems to be that most distinct life which is life indeed, whereas the bodily life is only a representation of that life, its shadow and its dream. For to live is to understand and to be wise, and to live by love with him who is life itself, is verily to live. 542. From these observations, it follows that by unanimous consent, the blessed ones conspire to the glory of their Lord, and to the love of the citizens in heaven and on earth. For the joy is elevated according to the number of those associated, and at the same time the inmost rejoice in love that the kingdom of God is increased, for this is the effect of either love. At length, from so many pure minds, the common animus of the society is inspired, just as in our body, for one animus or lower mind is inspired by the minds of the intellectories. So it is with the common intellect. What influx, however, that common animus has into our souls, this is not to be described here, for the communication of that society with us takes place only through our souls. Therefore may thy kingdom come and thy will be done, on earth as in the heavens.
Chapter 30. Concerning Hell, or the Society of Unhappy Souls. 543. The society of those who live in the contrary loves, or in hatred to God and their neighbor, is called infernal, diabolical, unhappy. It exists wholly in order that there may be every variety interposed between the two, and indeed actually. For in the spiritual idea of the soul there can be no existence which is not actual, since the soul is pure intelligence, nor is it obstructed with any shades of ignorance, nor can intermediate things exist without their opposites. For their quality is only known by knowing their relations in opposition. Hence the devil actually exists, and an infernal society, or a society burning with the love of destroying the heavenly society. Without such an evil society the blessed would not be kindled with any zeal and ardour, nor would their souls burn with eager desire to protect the Church. Thus they feel their happiness increased by the existence of a life contrary to their own. 544. Into this society come all souls which hold in hatred God and the neighbor. From their principles, that is, from their love, flow forth crimes and wickedness of every sort. They are defiled with vices. They themselves suffer most deeply from their own consciences, when they behold with open eyes the truths which in this life they had endeavored to dissipate with specious arguments and sophistic reasonings. But when there is no ignorance, only a bare knowledge of truths, as after death in souls, and when the state of the soul has been already deformed, and has so drawn down that nature that it cannot return to its more beautiful state, then it cannot help suffering the most deep and intense anguish and torture. And because this suffering is spiritual and in the soul, it cannot be described in words or conceived in ideas, for it surpasses flames, the gnashing of teeth, and many other punishments of earth. It is as though they were inwardly suffering from blazing and boiling oil poured from an inexhaustible vessel. 545. That this society also should be provided with its leader and chief would seem to be undeniable, because all these souls constitute one society or hell, and without a leader one would rush upon another, like Erinyes and Furies. No higher or mutual love conjoins these souls, but only the fear of their leader or chief, to whom perhaps is given the power of torturing the subject souls as often as they do not perform their duty. And so long as it is a society, there seems to be some hope remaining of warring against heaven, and of exalting oneself to the throne. They know indeed the impossibility of this, but nevertheless a pure hatred so persuades them. Therefore, as long as they enjoy and hope, and as this grows from the increase of their numbers, they seem in some manner to be happy, not inwardly but superficially, just as the envious are inwardly pained at the misfortune of even an unknown person, not from sympathy or love, but because this reminds them of the misery that they themselves are to endure for ever. 546. But nevertheless, in the last judgment, when the splendor of omnipotence, omnipresence, wisdom, justice, and divine love shall shine forth most fully, so that each one may view his previous life clearly depicted in his own state, and without the sentence being pronounced may know of what punishment he is worthy, since all things will then be manifest, although in the immediate light of wisdom. Then this society shall lose all hope, and shall contemplate in full view its eternal ruin. And while it beholds not only the kingdom of God, but also the felicity of the members of that society so completely and purely revealed, hatred becomes changed into envy, and envy into misery and anxieties. Then it is that this distracted form of society, from its own inward hatred, as though of a furious madness, rushes violently one upon another, and through the communion of souls, agreeing in their hatred toward heavenly society, but discordant among themselves, one becomes the devil tyrant of another, with all reins let loose in utter freedom, much as it is on earth, when liberty is subject to no restraint. 547. This, although the largest society, shall after the judgment cease to be a society, and although it would do so, it shall nevertheless avail nothing against the least society of heaven, for these are most closely conjoined in mutual love, yea, bound together under the divine love. But infernal souls are only united under their chief, unconnected by any mutual love, but rather disjoined in perpetual hatred, and besides separated by God the Uniter. So is the least handful of celestial souls able to put to flight a whole army of the impious, especially since these are afraid of themselves, and flee from the truth which they contemplate in themselves, and are therefore without any self-confidence. Hence one blessed soul may put to flight many thousand souls of the unhappy. 548. The ancients, both philosophers and physicists, and the pagan priests, by common consent have confirmed the doctrine of infernal sufferings. They have described their punishments, that of Tantalus and others, also Erebus, Styx, the Erinyes, the Furies. Pythagoras, Plato, and others have thought still more regarding these subjects. For by their light of nature they have seen that by no means can they be happy who have not in this life prepared for themselves a way through virtue to happiness. Chapter 31, concerning the divine providence. 549. There is no one, I think, so insane as to deny that there is a certain supreme direction or divine providence. For all things are full of deity, and we admire in each and everything the order which is attributed to nature and its perpetual preservation, not by itself, which would be absurd, but by some higher being from whom it has existence and subsequently subsistence. We see blended together a multitude of phenomena, going to prove a regulating providence, as that all things seem to be for the sake of use or an end, especially that one end seems to exist on account of another, so that there may be a series of ends from a certain first through intermediates to a last or another first. But, for example, the earth itself exists that it should be inhabited by animated beings; the mineral kingdom that it may produce the vegetable that it may nourish and sustain the animal; the lower species of animals that they may serve the higher; and all that they may serve the human race; the atmospheres that we may be enclosed and held in the body, and that we may breathe and talk; the ether with the sun, that each being may exist, and also that we may see. But why mention more? There is not a worm, nor a plant, nor a blade of grass without its use, namely, that it may serve as a means to a certain end. So that the visible world is a complex of means to an end beyond the world or beyond its own nature, for there is a progression of ends through natural effects, and thus through universal nature. That there is such a perpetual relation and progress of ends, namely, that one is always for the sake of another, is to be held as attributable to a divine providence, indeed, as indicating that God has so provided all particulars that they shall maintain this their order. 550. The universe, with each most particular thing in it, is the work of God alone, for nothing could flow from itself. What can exist without an origin? If the origin belong to nature itself, whence then is nature, unless you worship that as God? And if these are the works of God, it is necessary that he sustain them, for without perpetual sustentation all things would relapse into their primitive chaos. Thence he must be actually omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, and if omnipotent, it follows that he provides for each and every thing in order that there may be ends intermediate to a further end. To rule and provide for a universe is the divine itself, and property of divinity, nor has this need of counsel nor of care. For from itself, of its own essence, wisdom and love, all these things flow in their connection, order, and their genuine series. 551. If there is a universal providence of God, there is also a particular one. For the universal never exists without particulars, from which it is called universal. Of what quality is the universal can be judged from the particulars. Thus from providence in most particular things may be judged what it is in the universal. Nor would there be any universal unless it concerned itself with particulars, and this indeed in the case of providence, in order that all these may conspire to universal ends. 552. All providence regards an end, and it foresees means to an end. Thence is the future embraced in the present, and the present is as the complex of the past. So is there a series of means to a certain end, which is the first in the mediates and in the ultimates. But of what nature is the divine providence we may see much better from examples than from bare axioms. 553. The end of creation, or the end on account of which the world was created, could be no other than the first and the last, or the most universal of all ends, and that which is perpetually reigning in the created universe, which is the complex of means conspiring to that end. No other end of creation can be given than that there may exist a universal society of souls, or a heaven, that is, the kingdom of God. That this was the end of creation may be proved by innumerable arguments, for it would be absurd to say that the world was created on account of the earth and terrestrial societies, and this miserable and perishable life, since all things on earth are for the sake of man, and all things in man for the sake of his soul, and the soul cannot be for no end. If then it exists for any end, it must be for a society in which God is present. For his providence regards souls which are spiritual, and his works are adapted to men and to their consociation. 554. In order that a celestial society, or society of souls, may exist, it is necessary that there be a most perfect form of government, namely, souls distinct among themselves, and every possible variety, which may be called harmonies between the souls, and so from such harmony there will arise a consensus and accord, which shall produce that entire effect and end which is always foreseen and provided. 555. Let there be this most universal end, which is at once the first, the all in the mediates, and the last, and thus the same as the first, and we shall see at once how the divine providence reigns in foreseeing and dispensing the mediates. It may be said God might create such a society at once, without our earth and worldly things. That is, he might fill heaven with souls without any generation and multiplication in this earth. This indeed cannot be denied. All things to God are possible. But there are also innumerable things which are to him impossible. For instance, to be imperfect, mortal, inconstant, wicked, unjust. This is repugnant to his nature, and because such a society as we have described, whose form is most perfect, can in no wise be given without every variety, even from the most perfect to the most imperfect, from the pure to the impure, from love to hatred, or because there are intermediates from given opposites, thus between the highest good or God and the greatest evil or the devil. Therefore, from these promises it would follow that God, because he is perfection itself, wisdom, goodness, and love, could in no wise create immediately any devil or any soul in whom evil or any guilt should reside. Hence not man together with vice, crime, and sin, and hence not such a variety as is required for such a society as we have described. For whatever immediately flowed from God cannot be otherwise than the best and the most perfect. But that the evil and the imperfect should have come into existence can be traced not immediately to God as a cause, but to the created subject itself, in which it is a nature. Thus it is from the devil himself that he arose against his God and became a rebel. It was from Adam that he did contrary to the divine commandment, seeking how he might enjoy a higher and more perfect existence. It is clear from the sacred scriptures that the divine providence did not lead Adam immediately to this evil, but that it permitted it, that it permitted the serpent, that it forbade to him the tree, that it created Adam free and did not instruct him, that in the moment that he ate he was not checked and made to abstain, as was Abraham when he would sacrifice his son, beside many other things which clearly demonstrate that there was a providence that he should be able to sin, and a foreknowledge that he would sin and lose his pristine integrity, and thus that this result should flow as from the very principle of his being, namely, that souls are to be distinguished one from another, and that every possible variety must exist between them, and so the end of creation or the kingdom of God be reached, whose seminaries are terrestrial societies, which likewise represent the heavenly society. For there is nothing given in this world which does not contain a representation of the future world. That this end may be obtained, it is necessary that man shall be allowed a free will. The cause of variety of subjects arises solely from free exercise and liberty of the will. Without this there would be no intellect, no morality, no virtue, no vice, no crime, no guilt, no affection of the mind or change of state. This is the reason why God has wished to preserve the free human will, strong and inviolate, even for the doing of evil deeds. So that we would seem to be almost willing to deny a divine providence for the same reason that we would affirm it. But the liberty allowed to human minds is not absolute, but limited. It is like a bird which the fowler holds bound by its foot or tied with a string, and which can move about to a certain distance. It is provided that it shall not go beyond this limit. 556. The means which restrict the free wills of men are numerous. There are, for instance, societies, and the forms of their government, laws, punishments of the body, judges, all things done in order that men shall not abuse their free will. There are consciences and laws and rights impressed on our minds, which are the most stringent bonds. There is religion or divine worship, the fear of eternal punishments and condemnation, and the love and hope of happiness. This therefore may be called the bond of society and of societies. There is a certain fate which follows every one, and abides with him continually, according to his crimes or his virtues. Concerning this we shall treat further on. There is especially the cause of fate, the influx of God himself by his Spirit into souls, which nevertheless exist as contingently, as if nothing by provision or consultation. 557. Meanwhile, unless such means had been provided, and God himself had been acting as the ruler and establisher of all, no human society whatever could have existed, where one always seeks the destruction of the other, and despises to despoil him of his goods, and when many esteem themselves higher than societies, and imagine that all things exist for themselves alone. Such a society, animated by a spirit destructive of society itself, nevertheless exists entire, and this could not be the case without a divine providence. 558. The very divine providence itself principally reigns in distinguishing particulars from particulars, lest there should be given one state of mind absolutely like another. On this account liberty is granted. Marriages are said to be foreordained in heaven. Marriages of parents and children, of brothers and sisters, are wholly forbidden. Schisms and controversies, as well of religion as of principles of economy, politics, philosophy, and physics, are tolerated and almost inspired. All differ in their principles, and thence in their mental dispositions, so that we say, many heads, many minds, animi. Nature herself abhors every equality between one thing and another, for such would be one and the same, and there would be nothing distinct, and hence nothing natural. 559. Providence reigns both particularly and universally in selecting and foreseeing those who are to attain to heavenly happiness. For the human race is the seminary itself of heaven, and the city of God or the Church is scattered throughout the universal world, and from thence is the celestial society collected. Thus all those who are called the elect are ruled by a particular providence of God. 560. This is the principal end, and these the means leading to that end. But there are still infinite means which in their essence as means pursue either mediately or immediately this series of ends, whether as pertaining to things mundane or corporeal, or to things spiritual. In regard to things corporeal, in order that the body may be covered or clothed, the whole globe furnishes the vestments, yea, even the worms do this. And as food is also necessary that man may live in the body, this is also provided. As for mundane affairs, there are the wealth and possessions necessary for civil existence, also the sciences, and innumerable other things. For the spiritual interests of man it is revealed of what nature heaven is, what the will is, how God is to be adored, and by what means the state of the soul is to be perfected, so that it may be a member of heaven, and this in such manner that its liberty may not be injured, but that it may freely turn itself to God. 561. But concerning providence, fate, fortune, predestination, and human prudence, we have already treated, which passages see and add. Chapter 32. The universal mathesis, or a mathematical philosophy of universals. 562. The celebrated Locke, in his treatise on the human understanding, says, "The ideas which form the basis of morality being all real essences, and of such a nature that they sustain a mutual connection and adaptation which may be discovered, it follows that as soon as we discover these relations we shall to that point be in possession of so many real, certain, and general truths. And I am sure that in following a good method one might bring a large part of moral science to such a degree of evidence and certitude, that an attentive and judicious man would no longer find in it any matter of doubt, more than he would in propositions of mathematics which have been demonstrated to him." Book 4, Chapter 12, Section 8. And elsewhere, "Perhaps if one should consider distinctly and with all possible care the kind of science which proceeds upon the basis of ideas and words, this would produce a logic and a critique different from those hitherto seen." Book 4, Chapter 21, Section 4. Again, "I do not doubt that in the state and present constitution of our nature, human knowledge may be carried far beyond any point thus far attained, if men will undertake sincerely and with entire mental freedom to perfect the means of discovering the truth with the same application and the same industry which they employ in coloring and maintaining a falsity, in defending a system of which they are declared partisans, or certain interests in which they are engaged." Book 4, Chapter 3, Section 6. Further, "The highest degree of our knowledge is intuition without reasoning, for this is certain knowledge, secure from all doubt, having no need of proof, and incapable of receiving it, because it is the highest point of all human certitude. Such is that which the angels now possess, and that which the spirits of the just, made perfect, will attain to in the life to come. It embraces 1,000 things which at present escape entirely our understanding, our reason in its limited range of vision catching few gleams of them, the rest remaining veiled in darkness from our view." Book 4, Chapter 17, Section 14. 563. There is given a science of sciences, or a universal science, which contains all others in itself, and parts of which can as it were be resolved into these and those particular sciences. Such a science is not acquired by learning, but it is connate, especially in souls which are pure intelligences. Such is the science of souls released from the body, and of angels, who, if they communicate their thoughts or converse, would seem unable to form any connection by words, which are all material ideas and forms, and which the mind understands as signs, knowing their meaning, and this from experience. But the soul, from this its science, contemplates all objects immediately as they are in themselves, thus whether good or evil, and according to their nature it assents or is averse. Unless the soul were furnished with such a science, it would be wholly unable to flow into our thoughts, and to infuse, as it were, the power of understanding and of expressing higher things. As also it would be unable to adapt all its organic forms to the inmost and most secret laws of mechanics, physics, chemistry, and many other phenomena. Therefore, that such a science exists, there can be no doubt. 564. For there are truths a priori, or propositions which are at once acknowledged as true, nor is there need for any demonstration a posteriori for proving them, nor of confirmation by experience, or by the senses. The truth itself presents itself naked, and as it were declares itself true. The mind is often indignant that such truths should have to be proved, when they are above all demonstration. For all harmonies, and thus all order, naturally soothe and delight the organs of our senses, while disharmony constrains and wounds them. So it is with truths, in which there is, as it were, an intellectual order. Wherefore, if we were not overburdened with the fetters of sciences, with the turbulent desires of the lower mind, and similar hindrances, we should be able to know truths purely, since a certain consent shines forth as something harmonious, and as from a sacred shrine, I know not where. 565. But the reason for this is that higher forms contain in themselves all those things which can be contained in the lower forms, as the universal genus contains all the species, so that the higher form is the order itself and the principle of the following forms, thence also of all other forms, modes, and qualities. And in themselves, as of their very nature, they perceive whatever agrees or disagrees with the form, and thence all that ever is given in the lower forms, if there is a connection therewith, such as that of the soul with the body by means of the organic forms. 566. This science indeed may seem to be capable of being reduced to rule, but by what mode of reasoning can be perceived from those things which are immediately around the internal sensory? Thus all ideas, both material and intellectual, are only mutations of the state of the sensory and of the intellectory. And these changes of state can be understood from a description of the forms, especially the circular and spiral. The soul perceives every such change, and knows what it signifies. The changes of state are universal and singular, common and particular, general, special, and individual, and all these can be subjected to a certain algebraic calculation, and be reduced by rules to equations in the same manner as is customary in the calculus of infinites. In the mind itself also all things are reduced to their equations, in which those things are together present, which before have been collected, or have taken place successively. Those things which are in contact with the internal sensory can be raised to higher powers, or elevated to higher degrees by their proper rules, and so changes of state still more universal exist. which contain together and successively infinitely more particulars corresponding to the truths themselves perceived by the soul from the changes of state. 567. Thus, indeed, it is possible to submit ideas of the mind to calculation, whence arises the universal mythesis; but it is not possible to deduce any certitude thence, unless there be a certitude proposed and acknowledged, from which equations are to be commenced. I would wish also to propose one other attempt. Indeed, I have ascertained its possibility, but there are many rules to be premised, and data proposed, and truths to be adjusted, before I may approach this. And still we fall at length into a great Gordian knot and equation, out of which greater labor is required to extricate ourselves than it is worth while to devote to it. And from the smallest fault in reckoning we are able to fall into many fallacies. On this account I forbear making the attempt, and in place of it I have desired to propose a certain key of natural and spiritual mysteries by the way of correspondences and representations, which more directly and certainly leads us into hidden truths. And upon this doctrine, since it is as yet unknown to the world, I ought to dwell at somewhat greater length.